I slowly got up from the chair and walked over to the living room window. Behind the glass stretched the painfully familiar yard, the very lawn that Janet and I had once planted together, the very maple trees we had planted in honor of Cody's birth. Now the trees towered above the roof of the house, their leaves rustling in the wind, reminding me how quickly time flies. Autumn had painted the leaves in shades of gold and crimson, colors my late wife had loved so much. I glanced at the clock on the mantelpiece. It was 2:30. In an hour, I would have to drive to my son's house for my granddaughter's birthday. Paige was turning 7, and Stacy, as always, was throwing a grand party. My daughter-in-law loved to show off her party planning skills by inviting half the neighborhood and hiring entertainers. I sighed, imagining how she would play the gracious hostess while giving me meaningful looks and making subtle remarks about my age and supposedly declining health. The house felt especially empty these days. 30 years ago, children's laughter filled the air. Little Cody raced through the hallways with his toy cars, and Janet sang in the kitchen while preparing family dinners. Her voice carried throughout the house as she hummed old tunes she remembered from her childhood, sometimes singing along with the radio. Now the rooms were silent, filled only with memories and dust that I didn't always have time to wipe away. I didn't want to hire a cleaner. It was too strange to see a stranger among Janet's things. I walked into the bedroom and stopped in front of the mirror. My gray hair was neatly combed, my shirt was clean and ironed, and my pants were dark blue, the very ones Janet had bought me last Christmas. At 73, I looked quite decent, although I knew that Stacy would still find something to complain about. She would surely notice that I had lost a little weight since my wife's death, or say something about my habit of limping on my left leg due to an old knee injury I had sustained in my youth while working on a construction site. On the bedside table was a photograph in a silver frame, Janet and I on the porch of the same house. The picture was taken on the day we bought it, exactly 30 years ago. Janet is smiling broadly, leaning against my shoulder, and I am hugging her waist. She is wearing the same blue dress with white polka dots that she wore on special occasions. Back then, it seemed to us that we had an eternity ahead of us, that we would grow old here together, babysit our grandchildren, and reminisce about our youth while sitting on that same porch. We made plans for decades to come. We wanted to remodel the kitchen, plant a rose garden by the back porch, and travel to Europe when we retired. Janet passed away 3 years ago, in October. Lung cancer, even though she never smoked and always led a healthy lifestyle. The disease progressed rapidly. It took only 6 months from the first symptoms to the end. At first, it was just fatigue, which we attributed to age. Then came a cough that lasted for weeks. By the time we finally got to the doctor, it was too late. Cody came more often then, bringing 4-year-old Paige with him, and even Stacy kept her composure and didn't make a scene. But as soon as the funeral was over and the guests had left, everything went back to normal. He took a gift for his granddaughter from the dresser, a beautiful doll in a pink dress with long golden hair. He spent a long time choosing it in the toy store on the main street, asking the young saleswoman what 7-year-old girls like these days. The girl was patient and kind, understanding the elderly man's confusion in the world of children's preferences. She showed me several options, explained which toys were popular now, helped me choose the most beautiful doll, and wrapped it in bright paper with a big pink bow. I remembered how skillfully Janet wrapped gifts. She did it with particular pleasure, as if the process itself gave her no less joy than the recipient. She had special scissors for paper and a collection of ribbons and bows, which she carefully stored in a separate box. In the hallway, I put on my best jacket, dark gray, wool, bought back when I was a manager at a construction company. I checked my pockets, car keys, wallet, handkerchief. Stacy constantly insisted that I sell my old sedan after Janet's death. She said that at my age it was dangerous to drive, that I could hit someone or get into an accident. At the time, I just nodded and promised to think about it, but I didn't sell it. The car was the last thread connecting me to my independence, to the ability to go wherever I wanted, whenever I wanted. As I left the house, I turned back for a second. The living room looked cozy in the soft light of the table lamp. Books on the shelves that Janet and I had collected throughout our lives. Photos of family trips and holidays on the walls. Her favorite violets on the windowsill, which I now watered myself. This was my whole life, all my memories of happy years together. Lately, I had been thinking more and more about what would happen to the house when I was gone. Cody would inherit everything, of course. The house, the furniture, the savings. But I doubted that my son would live here. Stacy had said more than once in my presence that the house was too old and needed too much repair, that it should be torn down and something modern built in its place, or that the land should be sold for development. I got into the car and started the engine. An old Frank Sinatra song was playing on the radio, the same one Janet and I danced to at our wedding 48 years ago. I turned up the volume and slowly pulled out of the driveway, taking one last look at the house in the rearview mirror. Ahead of me lay another family celebration where I would feel like a spare part, like an awkward piece of old furniture that had nowhere to go but was too awkward to throw away. The drive to Cody's house took about 20 minutes of leisurely driving through Sheridan. I drove slowly, enjoying the familiar sights of the small town where I had lived my entire adult life. Every street was familiar to me, every turn and every house reminding me of something. There was the Miller grocery store, where Janet bought groceries for the week and always took a long time to choose the freshest vegetables. Here was the high school with the red brick facade where Cody went and played on the school basketball team. Here was the city park with the large pond where Janet and I would walk on weekends, feed the ducks, and discuss our plans for the future. Driving past St. Thomas Church where we were married and where Janet's funeral was held, I felt a familiar heaviness in my chest. The cemetery was behind the church, and I knew that my wife was buried there, under an old oak tree. I visited her every week, brought fresh flowers, and told her about what was happening in my life. I also told her about Stacy, about her increasingly blunt hints that it was time for me to think about a nursing home. Time passed slowly, and I realized that I was deliberately not rushing to get to my destination. I didn't want to see Stacy's fake happy smile, listen to her veiled reproaches about my lifestyle, or feel like an unwanted burden in my own son's house. But for Paige's sake, I was willing to endure it again and again, because my granddaughter was the only real bright spot in my current life. She reminded me of Cody as a child, just as curious and cheerful, with the same dark eyes. Turning onto Maple Street, where Cody lived with his family, I saw the familiar two-story house with its immaculately mowed lawn and well-tended flower beds. Stacy was proud of her home and was constantly changing and improving it, repapering, rearranging furniture, hanging new curtains. Several cars were already parked in the driveway. Apparently, other guests had already arrived for the children's party. I recognized the car belonging to the Reynolds, neighbors with whom Stacy was friends, and the gray minivan belonging to the Clarks, whose daughter was Paige's classmate. I parked at the side of the road, turned off the engine, and sat in silence for a few minutes, gathering my courage before the ordeal ahead. The lights were on in the house, and I could hear voices and children's laughter. Somewhere behind those walls, my only granddaughter was celebrating her 7th birthday, and her mother was preparing to show her guests what a caring daughter-in-law she was. I took the beautifully wrapped gift from the back seat and slowly made my way to the front door. Cody and Stacy's house always looked like something out of a magazine about country living. A perfect lawn, neatly trimmed bushes, a decorative stone path leading to a porch with white columns. All this splendor cost a lot of money, and I knew that the young family had gone into serious debt for the sake of appearances. Stacy was obsessed with making their house look as good as, if not better than, their neighbors. Before I could climb the steps to the porch, the door swung open and Stacy herself appeared on the threshold. She was 34 years old, but she looked younger thanks to regular visits to the beautician and hairdresser. Today she was wearing a beige sheath dress that fit her slender figure perfectly, her hair was styled impeccably, and her makeup was applied with professional precision. Even at home at a children's party, Stacy looked as if she was about to go to a business meeting or a social event. "Lawrence, I'm so glad you came," she exclaimed with a broad smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Paige is already asking where Grandpa is. Please come in. Don't stand in the doorway." I knew this game. In front of guests, Stacy always played the caring daughter-in-law, but as soon as we were alone or with the family, her tone changed dramatically. She stepped aside to let me into the house, and I caught the familiar scent of the expensive perfume she always wore. The hallway was filled with a festive atmosphere. Colorful balloons were tied to the stair railing, garlands of paper flags hung on the walls, and a red carpet led to the living room. "You look good," Stacy continued, looking me up and down. "A little thin, though." Probably not eating right. Single men often forget about proper nutrition. I'll make you some meal prep containers so you don't have to cook for yourself. Here we go. Under the guise of concern, Stacy had already managed to hint at my helplessness and loneliness. Meal prep containers were her favorite way of emphasizing that, in her opinion, I couldn't cope with living on my own. Although I was a pretty good cook, Janet had taught me the basics in the early years of our marriage, when she was working shifts at the hospital. Thanks, Stacy, but I'm doing just fine on my own, I replied calmly, taking off my jacket. Where's the birthday girl? I want to wish her a happy birthday. Oh, Paige is in the living room with the other children. The entertainer is showing them magic tricks. It costs a fortune. But what wouldn't you do for your child? Stacy took my jacket and hung it in the closet. By the way, could you take off your shoes? You see, we have a new carpet in the living room. Light beige, very stain-prone. The guest slippers are over here. I looked at her pointed high-heeled shoes, which she clearly had no intention of taking off, then at the dull gray slippers she was pointing to. Another way to make me feel awkward, forcing me to change my shoes while the other guests were walking around in theirs. But I didn't argue. Today was not the day. Of course, I agreed, sitting down on the bench and untying my shoelaces. At that moment, a child's voice rang out from the living room. Grandpa, Grandpa's here. Paige ran out into the hallway, beaming with joy. She was wearing a pink dress with a fluffy skirt and white tights, her hair tied back in two ponytails decorated with shiny barrettes. She rushed towards me and I picked her up, feeling my heart fill with warmth. For the sake of this hug, I was willing to endure any humiliation. Happy birthday, sunshine, I said, kissing her on the cheek. You look so beautiful today. A real princess. Thank you, Grandpa. What's in the bag? Is it a present for me? Maybe, I winked at her. But first, let's go to the other guests and say hello to everyone. Paige took me by the hand and dragged me into the living room. Stacy followed behind, and I could feel her gaze on my back. About 15 people, adults and children, had gathered in the large, bright room. In the center stood a man in a bright suit and top hat, performing magic tricks with handkerchiefs and cards. The children sat on the floor in a semicircle, while the adults sat in armchairs and on the sofa, sipping coffee and talking in low voices. I recognized most of the faces. They were Stacy's neighbors and co-workers. A woman in her 40s with short hair named Deborah worked with Stacy at an advertising agency. Next to her sat her husband, Thomas, a programmer, a quiet man with glasses. The Clarks, Robert, and Susie were the parents of Paige's classmate. I recognized a few other faces from previous family events. Look who's here, Stacy announced loudly. Grandpa Lawrence decided to join our celebration. We were worried he'd forgotten his granddaughter's birthday. Several people turned in my direction and greeted me politely. Deborah smiled and waved. The Clarks nodded from their seats. Stacy continued. Lawrence has been living alone in a big house for 3 years now. We're always worried about him. At his age, it's so difficult to manage the household, especially in winter. Either the heating breaks down or the plumbing leaks. I felt the blood rush to my face. Stacy was discussing my personal life in front of strangers, portraying me as a helpless old man who couldn't cope with basic household problems. I wanted to protest, to say that my heating and plumbing were fine, that I was perfectly capable of handling all my household chores, but that would have meant making a scene at a children's party. At that moment, Cody appeared from the kitchen with a tray of glasses filled with some kind of drink. My son looked tired and slightly confused. At 36, he was going bald early, wore glasses, and had put on a little weight. Working at the bank wasn't easy for him. I could see how nervous he was about the constant pressure from his bosses. On top of that, Stacy was constantly demanding more money for her home improvement and lifestyle projects. Hi, Dad, he said, setting the tray on the coffee table. Glad you could make it. Hi, son. Happy birthday to your daughter. Cody nodded and walked over to me. We hugged, and I could feel him trembling with tension. Meanwhile, Stacy continued to entertain the guests with stories about the difficulties of life for the elderly. Can you imagine, last week I called Lawrence 3 days in a row, and he didn't answer. Cody and I were about to go check on him. It turned out he had simply forgotten to turn on the ringer on his phone. At that age, your memory isn't what it used to be. We constantly worry. What if something happens to him and no one knows? It was a lie. Stacy never called me 3 days in a row. In fact, she rarely called, and only when necessary. The story about the phone was completely made up, but the guests listened sympathetically, nodding and exchanging glances. Deborah even sighed and shook her head. Yes, that's a big problem, she agreed. My mom lives alone too, and we're constantly worried. We've suggested several times that she move into a nice retirement home, but she categorically refuses. Exactly, Stacy chimed in. Older people often don't realize that they need help. They cling to their familiar lifestyle, not noticing that they can no longer cope, and their relatives suffer, not knowing how to help them. I stood in the middle of the living room and listened to them discuss my life as if I weren't there. Stacy skillfully presented the information in such a way that the guests felt sympathy for my difficult situation and at the same time for her difficult role as a caring daughter-in-law. Cody was silent, nervously adjusting his glasses and avoiding my gaze. Meanwhile, the entertainer finished his magic show and announced that it was time to play active games. The children jumped up from the floor and ran to clear the furniture from the center of the room. The adults moved to the walls and continued their conversations. I took advantage of the commotion and approached Cody. Can we talk? I asked quietly. My son nodded, and we went out into the hallway. It was quieter here, with only muffled voices from the living room and the children's laughter. Dad, I'm sorry about Stacy, Cody began, not looking me in the eye. She's just worried about you. We're both worried. What exactly are you worried about? I asked. That I live in my own house, or that I don't want to get rid of it? Cody hesitated, twirling an empty glass in his hands. Well, the house is really big for one person, and it's expensive to maintain. And if something happens... Cody, I interrupted, do you really think I can't handle it? Or is that what Stacy thinks? My son sighed and finally looked at me. I don't know, Dad. Stacy says she thinks you'd be better off in a special place where there's medical care, where you can find friends your own age. And what do you think? Cody was silent for a few seconds, clearly struggling with himself. I think it's your decision, he finally said. But Stacy, she insists that we have to think about your future. Loud children's laughter and music came from the living room. Apparently, the game had started. Stacy appeared in the doorway and looked at us disapprovingly. Cody, where are you? Robert is asking about that project at the bank. And anyway, it's not nice to ignore your guests. I'm coming, Cody muttered and hurried back to the living room. Stacy lingered and looked at me with an expression of poorly concealed irritation. Lawrence, I hope you're not upsetting Cody by talking about the past. Today is a holiday, and I don't want anything to spoil it. I just congratulated my son on his daughter's birthday, I replied calmly. Of course, she smiled sourly. By the way, would you mind going back to the guests? They're already asking where Grandpa is, and Paige is waiting for your gift. We returned to the living room, where the children were playing musical chairs. Paige ran around the chairs with the other children, laughing and pushing each other. When the music stopped, she quickly took a seat and waved happily at me. I waved back, feeling my heart warm at her genuine joy. Meanwhile, the adults continued their conversations. Deborah talked about a new advertising campaign their agency was developing. The Clarks discussed their plans for summer vacation. Stacy participated in all the conversations, glancing my way from time to time and commenting on how nice it was to see the whole family together, and especially the older generation. The game ended, and the animator announced a break. Stacy clapped her hands to get everyone's attention. Now it's time for presents, she announced. Paige, sit here in the birthday chair. Paige excitedly took her place in the large chair decorated with balloons. The guests took turns approaching her with gifts. The Clarks gave her a painting set, Deborah gave her a beautiful book of fairy tales, and the other guests gave her toys, clothes, and sweets. Paige happily thanked everyone, unwrapped the gifts, and showed them to the others. Finally, it was my turn. I walked over to the chair and handed my granddaughter her gift. From Grandpa, I said, with love. Paige carefully unwrapped the package and gasped when she saw the beautiful doll. Oh, how beautiful. Thank you, Grandpa. She hugged the doll and held it close. What should I name her? Whatever you want, sweetheart. She's your new friend now. Stacy came closer and picked up the doll, examining it. That's very nice, she said in a tone that was difficult to call sincere. But Paige already has a lot of dolls. Perhaps it would have been better to ask her what she wanted. But thanks anyway. Another jab. Even the choice of gift was wrong, according to Stacy. I said nothing, looking at my granddaughter's happy face, who was clearly delighted with her new toy. The guests began to leave. Deborah and her husband were the first to say goodbye and leave, citing other plans. The Clarks followed. Gradually, the living room emptied, leaving only the family's closest friends and us, the relatives. Stacy bustled about, gathering gift wrapping and disposable tableware. Cody helped her, silently stacking chairs. Paige played in the corner with her new toys. The entertainer packed up his supplies and said goodbye as well. I sat on the sofa, watching this family scene and thinking about what had just happened. Throughout the evening, Stacy methodically humiliated me in front of the guests, presenting me as a decrepit old man incapable of living on my own. Cody remained silent and did not defend his father, and I endured all this for the sake of a few minutes of communication with my granddaughter. When most of the guests had left, only Stacy's closest friends remained in the house. Deborah and her husband Thomas, the writer couple who lived next door, and a young woman named Victoria, Stacy's colleague from the advertising agency. The atmosphere became more relaxed, and I hoped that now Stacy would stop her attacks on me. But my hope was in vain. On the contrary, in a smaller circle, she felt even more at ease. "Now we can relax," announced the hostess, taking a bottle of white wine out of the refrigerator. "Cody, please bring some nice glasses, not the plastic ones we used for the children. And make some tea for Lawrence. He can't drink alcohol anymore. He has blood pressure problems." I looked at my sister-in-law in surprise. I had no blood pressure problems, and she knew that very well. What's more, I could easily afford a glass of wine at the festive table. But Stacy had already managed to give the guests the impression that I was a sick and frail old man who needed special care and medical restrictions. "Actually, my blood pressure is fine," I calmly objected. "And a glass of wine won't hurt me." "Come on, Lawrence," Stacy smiled condescendingly. "At your age, you need to be more careful. Remember how you complained to Cody last week about feeling dizzy? That's a sure sign of vascular problems." Another lie. I hadn't complained to Cody about dizziness because I wasn't dizzy. But Stacy said it with such conviction that the guests involuntarily believed her. Deborah nodded sympathetically, and Victoria shook her head, clearly feeling sorry for the poor old man with health problems. "Age is a serious matter," agreed Mrs. Ryder, a woman in her 50s with neat gray hair. "My father also denied his problems at first, and then he had a minor stroke. It's a good thing we persuaded him to move to a specialized center in time." "Oh, I know exactly what you mean," exclaimed Stacy, pouring wine into glasses. "Older people are very stubborn about this. They don't want to admit that they can no longer live independently, and their relatives have to constantly worry and monitor the situation." Cody brought in a tray with glasses and silently placed them on the coffee table. He was clearly uncomfortable, but he didn't say anything. I noticed how he avoided looking me in the eye, as if he was ashamed of what was happening but couldn't bring himself to stop his wife. "By the way, Lawrence," Stacy continued, sitting down opposite me with a glass in her hand, "I noticed that you look a little pale today, and you've lost a lot of weight. Are you eating properly? Don't forget to eat." All eyes turned to me. I felt like an exhibit in a museum, being examined and discussed by visitors. Stacy skillfully created the impression that I was suffering from senile forgetfulness and might simply forget to eat. Although in reality, I keep a close eye on my diet and cook myself full lunches and dinners. "I'm eating normally," I replied cautiously, "and my weight is normal." Of course," Stacy nodded in a tone usually used to calm capricious children. "It's just that when people are alone, they often stop taking care of themselves. It's natural. I remember Cody and I dropping by unexpectedly once, and there was practically nothing in the fridge. Just some canned food and stale bread." That was another lie. Stacy and Cody never dropped by unexpectedly. They always warned me about their visits in advance, and they rarely visited me. And I always have fresh food in my fridge because I go shopping regularly, twice a week. "Yes, that's a problem," agreed Victoria, a young woman with short red hair. "My grandmother had the same thing. She could go all day without eating anything and then wonder why she felt sick. We had to hire a nurse to monitor her diet." "A caregiver is a good idea," Deborah chimed in, "although it's expensive, of course, but health is more important." Stacy smiled with satisfaction, seeing how skillfully she was steering the conversation in the right direction. One after another, the guests told stories about their elderly relatives who couldn't cope with everyday life and needed outside care. Each story was presented as confirmation that people my age inevitably become a burden on their families. And as for the house, Stacy continued, taking a sip of wine, it's simply unrealistic for one person to maintain such a large property. Lawrence has a two-story house with 5 rooms and a large plot of land. That's a lot of work. Cleaning, repairs, gardening. Indeed, a lot, agreed Mr. Ryder, a man with a neat beard who worked for a construction company. I know myself how hard it is to keep an old house in order. Something is always breaking, requiring attention. And in winter, it's especially problematic. Exactly, exclaimed Stacy. Lawrence, do you remember how your heating broke down last winter? We were so worried. What if the furnace had broken down completely? You could have frozen. I remember that incident. Indeed, there was a small problem with the boiler, but I quickly called a repairman and had everything fixed. There was no risk of freezing, and Stacy knew it. But in her account, a common household nuisance turned into a serious threat to my life. And then there's that staircase to the second floor, she added, shaking her head. It's so steep. Every time I'm afraid that Lawrence might fall and break his leg. And at his age, a fracture heals very slowly. Paige was playing in the corner of the living room, dressing her new doll in different outfits. She wasn't listening to the adults' conversation, completely absorbed in her game, and I was grateful for that. I didn't want my granddaughter to hear her mother describe her grandfather as a helpless and sick old man. Have you thought about moving to a more suitable place? Victoria asked, looking at me with genuine sympathy. There are some very good residences for the elderly. They have round-the-clock medical care, meals, and leisure activities. Yes, Deborah agreed. My aunt has been living in one for 2 years and is very happy there. She says she finally feels safe. Stacy watched my reaction closely, waiting for me to speak. She had masterfully created a situation in which refusing to consider a nursing home would seem stubborn and unreasonable. Everyone present was already convinced that moving to a specialized facility was the only reasonable solution for someone in my situation. Thank you for your concern, I said in as neutral a tone as possible, but I'm doing just fine on my own for now. Of course, Stacy quickly agreed. Cody and I are just thinking about your future. You see, you're still holding up now, but what about in a year or two? It's better to prepare in advance than to have to deal with it in an emergency. Cody coughed and finally decided to say something. Stacy, maybe we shouldn't talk about this right now. We're celebrating. You're right, dear, his wife agreed, but I could see the irritation in her eyes at Cody interrupting her monologue. It's just that we so rarely get together, so I want to discuss important issues. She got up and headed to the kitchen for snacks. Thomas, Deborah's silent husband, took advantage of the pause and started talking about the weather. The conversation smoothly moved on to other topics. The upcoming weekend, vacation plans, news in the city. But I felt that the respite was temporary and that Stacy had not yet finished her campaign to discredit my independence. A few minutes later, the hostess returned with a plate of cheese and fruit. She placed the refreshments on the table and took her seat again, looking attentively at those present. By the way, Lawrence, she said casually, did you remember to take your pills this morning? I've noticed that you sometimes get confused with your medications. Everyone looked at me again. I wasn't taking any regular medication, except for vitamins, which I took from time to time. But Stacy was again giving the impression that I had serious health and memory problems. I don't need any medication, I replied patiently. Oh, yes, of course, Stacy laughed falsely. You don't like going to the doctor. Cody, remember how long it took us to convince your father to get checked out? Preventive care is so important in old age. Cody shifted uncomfortably in his chair. He knew perfectly well that no one had to convince me because I get regular checkups and take care of my health. But he didn't dare argue with his wife. Yes, prevention is essential, agreed Mrs. Ryder, especially cardiac examinations. With age, the heart requires special attention. And you need to check your memory, added Deborah. There are special tests. It's better to identify problems at an early stage. Stacy nodded approvingly, seeing her guests supporting the necessary topic. She methodically created the image of a caring daughter-in-law who was forced to worry about the health of her stubborn father-in-law who refused medical help. He also has coordination problems, she continued, lowering her voice to a confidential whisper. I've noticed several times that he walks unsteadily, holding onto furniture. I'm afraid he might fall. That was too much. I had no coordination problems. I walked confidently, did light exercise, and kept myself in good shape. The slight limp on my left leg from an old injury was not a coordination problem, but the result of a long-healed fracture. "Stacy," I said firmly, "I think you're exaggerating." "Come on, Lawrence," she replied gently. "We're family. We have to take care of each other. And if we see that you're having a hard time, it's normal to offer help." Victoria leaned forward sympathetically. "Have you thought about installing special handrails and an emergency call button in the house? There are modern security systems for the elderly." "Great idea," exclaimed Stacy. "And you can install video surveillance so that relatives can monitor the situation remotely." I felt sickened by such concern. Video surveillance in my own home? An emergency call button? Did they want to turn my house into an intensive care unit? I understood that this was all part of Stacy's campaign to force me to move into a nursing home. First, she creates an image of a sick and helpless old man. Then she offers temporary safety measures. And then she concludes that it would be easier to move to a specialized facility. Paige put down her doll and came over to me. "Grandpa, will you push me on the swing in the yard?" she asked, taking my hand. I looked gratefully at my granddaughter, who had unwittingly given me the opportunity to leave this humiliating discussion of my supposed infirmity. "Of course, sweetheart. Let's go." "Be careful," Stacy immediately interjected. "It's slippery outside. You might slip. And don't swing too hard. You might get dizzy." I said nothing and headed for the exit with Paige. Behind me, I could hear Stacy continuing to explain to the guests what a heavy burden their family carried, caring for an elderly relative who refused to acknowledge his helplessness and stubbornly clung to his independence. Paige and I went out into the yard, where it was indeed cool and damp after the recent rain. The swing was in the far corner of the yard, under a large maple tree whose leaves had already begun to fall, covering the ground with a yellow and red carpet. My granddaughter climbed onto the wooden seat, holding tightly to the ropes, and I carefully began to swing her. She laughed and asked me to swing her higher, her joyful voice echoing throughout the yard. "Grandpa, why does Mom say you're sick?" Paige asked suddenly, turning to me. My heart skipped a beat, so she had heard the adults talking after all. Children are always more attentive than we think, and they pick up on much more than we realize. "Mom is just worried about me, sweetheart," I replied, trying to sound calm. "Grown-ups sometimes worry too much." "Could you really fall down the stairs?" my granddaughter continued to ask. "No, Paige. I've been walking up and down stairs for many, many years, and I've never fallen. Don't worry about it." She nodded and turned back to face forward, enjoying the swing, but I could see that my words hadn't completely reassured her. Stacy's words had sown anxiety even in a child's heart, causing the 7-year-old girl to worry about her grandfather. A few minutes later, we were called back into the house. Stacy announced that it was time to cut the birthday cake. We returned to the living room, where a large 3-layer cake with pink frosting and 7 candles was already displayed on the coffee table. The guests gathered around, and Cody got his camera ready to capture the solemn moment. Paige made a wish and blew out the candles to the applause of those present. Stacy began cutting the cake into portions and placing them on plates. The atmosphere was festive and warm, but I felt tense, expecting another trick from my sister-in-law. "And now," Stacy announced solemnly when everyone had received their slices of cake, "I have another special gift for our dear grandfather." All eyes turned to her. Cody raised his eyebrows in surprise. Apparently, he knew nothing about a gift for his father. Stacy disappeared into the next room and returned with a colorful bag tied with a gold ribbon. "Lawrence, this is from our whole family," she said, handing me the bag with a broad smile. "We thought long and hard about what to give you, and finally found the perfect thing." I took the bag in my hands, feeling everyone's curious eyes on me, waiting to see what was inside. Stacy stood nearby, a strange spark of anticipation in her eyes. Something about her behavior made me wary, but it was impossible to refuse a gift in front of guests. Unwrapping the package, I saw a glossy brochure with a photo of a beautiful building on the cover. In large letters it said, "Golden Years Residence, a comfortable life for people of the Silver Age." Below, in small print, were listed the services: medical care, 3 meals a day, organized leisure activities, and round-the-clock security. The guest fell silent, clearly embarrassed by the unexpected contents of the gift. Deborah coughed awkwardly, Victoria stared at her plate of cake, and Mr. Ryder frowned. Only Stacy continued to smile, watching my reaction. Cody and I went there on a tour, she continued, seemingly oblivious to the general embarrassment. It's a wonderful place. Very modern facilities, qualified staff, a varied leisure program. There's a library, a gym, even a swimming pool. And most importantly, you'll be safe. I silently leafed through the pages of the brochure, looking at photos of happy elderly people doing yoga, playing chess, and having lunch in the communal dining room. On the last page was a sticker with a handwritten note, "It's time to think about the future. With love, Stacy and Cody." Cody looked extremely uncomfortable. He clearly hadn't been involved in choosing this gift and had only just found out what was inside. My son avoided my gaze, nervously fiddling with his napkin. "Well, what do you think?" Stacy asked, still enthusiastic. "We can go there together, look at the rooms, meet the staff. I've already arranged a meeting with the administrator for next week." Paige came up to me and looked at the brochure. "Grandpa, what's this?" "It's a place where elderly people live," her mother explained, stroking her daughter's head. "Grandpa will be very happy there. Much happier than living alone in a big house." The guests remained silent. The situation was so awkward that even the family's closest friends didn't know what to say. Giving a brochure about a nursing home as a gift at a family celebration was beyond the bounds of propriety, even if it was presented as a gesture of care. I closed the brochure and looked calmly at Stacy. I saw triumph in her eyes. She was sure she had put me in an impossible position. Refusing such a gift in front of witnesses would make me look like a stubborn old man, unwilling to accept the sensible advice of his caring family. "Thank you, Stacy," I said in an even voice. "A very original gift." "Oh, you're welcome," she exclaimed. "We're family. We have to take care of each other. And the sooner we start planning for the future, the better for everyone." Victoria smiled uncertainly and tried to lighten the mood. "Planning is important indeed, although maybe we shouldn't rush into any decisions." "Why rush?" Stacy interrupted her. "It's better to think everything through in advance, choose a good place, and get the paperwork done. Otherwise, it may be too late if an emergency arises." Deborah glanced at her husband, clearly signaling that it was time for them to leave. Thomas got the hint and looked at his watch. "Oh, how quickly time has flown," Deborah said, getting up from her seat. "We have to go home. We have to get up early for work tomorrow." The other guests also began to gather their things. The Riders said goodbye and left first, followed by Victoria. They all clearly felt uncomfortable about what had happened and hurried to leave the house where family problems had been exposed for all to see. When the door closed behind the last guests, only the family members remained in the house. Stacy began clearing the table, humming something under her breath. She was clearly pleased with how the evening had turned out. Cody helped her silently, still avoiding looking in my direction. Paige played with her new doll on the floor. "I hope you'll seriously consider our offer, Lawrence," Stacy said, stacking the dirty plates. "We're really worried about you. And the longer you put off your decision, the harder it will be later." I put the brochure on the coffee table and got up from the sofa. The moment I had been waiting for several months had arrived. The moment when I had to say what I had been thinking all this time. "Stacy," I said calmly, "you're right about one thing. It really is time to make decisions about the future." She turned to me and a flicker of joy crossed her eyes. My sister-in-law thought I was ready to give in. "I've already made up my mind," I continued. "Next week I'm putting the house up for sale." Stacy froze with the plates in her hands and Cody looked up sharply. "And I'm moving to Arizona," I added. "To my old friend Albert. He's been offering me a place to stay for a long time. He has a big house, and he could use some company too." Stacy's face changed before my eyes. Joy gave way to surprise, then anxiety. But that's so far away," she muttered. "What about Paige? What about the family?" "The family can visit me if they want to," I replied, "and Paige can come for vacations. Arizona has a wonderful climate. She'll love it." Cody finally found the strength to say something. "Dad, what about the house?" I thought. He didn't finish, but I understood what he was thinking. My son expected that sooner or later he would inherit the family home and all its possessions. Stacy had been making plans for this inheritance for many years. "I'll sell the house and spend the money on a new life," I said simply. "Albert wants to buy a boat, so we'll go fishing together. Maybe we'll take that cruise your mom and I always dreamed of, but never got around to." Stacy put the plates back on the table. Her face paled and her eyes took on an expression I would describe as panic. "Lawrence, are you serious?" she asked in a trembling voice. "But we can work something out here. We don't have to sell the house. We can just, well, find another solution." "What solution?" I asked, continuing to speak calmly and reasonably. "You spent the whole evening convincing your guests that I'm a sick and helpless old man who needs constant care. So why do you need such a burden?" Cody blushed and tried to object. "Dad, you don't understand. Stacy just—" "What, just?" I interrupted him. "Just caring? It's a strange kind of care. Publicly humiliating a person, exposing him as senile in front of strangers." Stacy tried to regain control of the situation. "I didn't humiliate anyone. I'm really worried about your health and safety." "Then you'll be happy to know that I'll be perfectly safe in Arizona," I replied. "Albert is only a year older than me, but he's great at taking care of things around the house. And there's a medical center right next to his house, so that won't be a problem either." Paige stopped playing and listened intently to our conversation. She didn't understand all the details, but she could sense the tension in the air. "When are you moving, Grandpa?" she asked. "Pretty soon, sweetheart. In a month or two." Stacy grabbed the back of her chair as if looking for support. Her plans were falling apart before her eyes. She had hoped to force me into a nursing home while retaining control of the family estate. Now it was becoming clear that not only was I leaving her influence, but I was also taking with me the entire inheritance she had already mentally claimed as her own. "But Lawrence," she began, trying to pull herself together, "let's not make any rash decisions. Maybe I really was too insistent in my suggestions. We can discuss everything calmly and find a compromise." I shook my head. "No compromises, Stacy. I've made my decision, and it's final." "Albert is already waiting for my call." Cody sat down in a chair and rubbed his face with his hands. He looked confused and depressed, as if he had only just realized what was happening to his family. "Dad, maybe we really can change something," he said quietly. "I understand that Stacy sometimes, well, worries too much, but her intentions are good." "Good intentions?" I asked. "Cody, your wife spent the whole evening telling strangers about my imaginary illnesses, making up stories about my supposed forgetfulness and helplessness. And then she gave me a brochure for a nursing home as a birthday present for my granddaughter. Do you consider that good intentions?" My son was silent, unable to find the words to justify himself. Stacy, seeing that the situation was getting out of control, tried to go on the offensive. "And what are you going to do with Paige? Just leave and forget about your granddaughter?" "I'm not going to forget about Paige," I replied firmly, "but I'm not going to put up with humiliation for a few hours in her company anymore. If you want to maintain a relationship, you're welcome to visit. Arizona is a beautiful state, and Paige will love it." My granddaughter came up to me and took my hand. "Grandpa, can I come visit you?" "Of course, sweetheart," I said, leaning down to her. "Whenever you want." Stacy watched the scene with an expression of poorly concealed anger. Her plan had failed completely, and now she realized that she had lost not only control over her father-in-law, but also the opportunity to influence the family inheritance. A tense silence fell over the living room. Stacy stood by the table, clutching a napkin in her hands, and I could see her trying to pull herself together. Her face changed expression periodically, from shock to attempts to smile, from confusion to poorly concealed anger. Cody sat in his chair with his head down, and Paige continued to hold my hand, sensing the tension between the adults, but not understanding its cause. "You know what, Lawrence," Stacy finally said, a metallic note creeping into her voice. "I think you're just tired today. It's been a long day, a lot of emotions. Maybe you should think about it again when you've had a chance to rest." She tried to smile understandingly, but it came out strained and fake. Stacy clearly hoped that my statement was just an emotional reaction to her gift, and that tomorrow I would change my mind and return to my former obedient state. "I'm not tired, Stacy," I replied calmly, "and my decision is well thought out. I've been thinking about it for several months." "Several months?" she asked, her voice rising. And you didn't tell us anything? Why should I have? I shrugged. You think I'm a helpless old man with memory problems. What significance could the decisions of such a person have? Stacy realized that I was using her own words from earlier in the evening against her. She tried to change tactics. Lawrence, you misunderstood me. I never thought you were helpless. I was just worried. Is it wrong for a family to care about each other? Caring is good, I agreed. But what you did today cannot be called caring. You methodically humiliated me in front of strangers, inventing non-existent illnesses and problems. And then you presented a brochure for a nursing home as a gift at a family celebration. Cody finally looked up at his wife. Stacy, you really went too far. It was Paige's birthday, not the time to discuss such things. Oh, is that so? Stacy exclaimed, and her carefully maintained mask of propriety began to crack. Now you're against me too? I'm the only one trying to think about the family's well-being, and you two are ganging up on me. Paige clung to my leg in fear. Her mother's loud voice frightened her, and she didn't understand why the adults were arguing on her birthday. I stroked my granddaughter's head, trying to calm her down. No one is ganging up on you, Cody said wearily. Dad just has the right to live the way he wants. Right. Stacy raised her voice even more. What about our rights? What about what we planned? Do you think I don't know what you've been dreaming about? About how we'll move into Dad's house when he gets worse? Cody blushed, realizing that his wife had voiced what they had probably discussed many times in private. Stacy, however, continued breaking down. We put so much into our relationship with your father. I put up with his quirks, his stubbornness, his unwillingness to accept reality. And now it turns out that he's going to sell everything and spend the money on some adventure in Arizona. There it is. The truth has finally come out. Stacy revealed the true motives behind her concern. She was counting on the inheritance and planned to move into my house after my death or placement in a nursing home. All her attempts to convince me that I couldn't cope with living on my own were aimed at one goal: to gain control of the family property. Stacy, shut up, Cody said quietly but sharply, not in front of Paige. Why should I shut up? She shouted. Your father is ruining our plans, our future. We were counting on this house, on stability, and he wants to squander everything on entertainment in his old age. Paige started crying. The loud voices and tense atmosphere were too much for a 7-year-old child. I picked her up and held her close. Hush, sweetheart. It's okay, I whispered in her ear. The grown-ups are just discussing important matters. But Stacy wasn't going to stop. All the grievances and calculations that had accumulated over the years burst out. Do you know how much we spend on gifts for Paige from Grandpa? Because you can't even choose a normal gift for a child. Birthdays, trips to see you, it all costs money and time. And we thought it was an investment in our relationship, that sooner or later. Stacy, Cody snapped at her. Enough! But it was too late. His sister-in-law had completely given herself away, showing that she even perceived gifts for her own daughter as a kind of bribe aimed at maintaining good relations with a potential benefactor. What do you mean enough? She continued, now completely unrestrained. I'll tell the truth. Your father is a selfish old man who only thinks about himself. He's willing to leave his own family with nothing for some childish fantasies about a new life. I gently sat Paige down on the sofa and stood in front of Stacy. She was trembling with anger, her face contorted, and her eyes burning with rage. Stacy, I said quietly but clearly, now I understand that I made the right decision. Thank you for your honesty. Don't you dare thank me, she screamed. You're destroying my family's life. My daughter's. You're robbing her of her future. I'm robbing her of her future? I asked. Or am I robbing you of the ability to control my property? Cody finally got up from his chair and walked decisively toward his wife. Stacy, stop this immediately. You're being disgusting. Disgusting? She turned to her husband with burning eyes. Your father is being disgusting. He deceived us. He pretended to be infirm, but all this time he was planning to run away with our money. What money? Cody protested. It's Dad's money, Dad's house. He has the right to do whatever he wants with it. Oh, really? Stacy laughed bitterly. And where were your principles all these years when we were planning how we were going to live in this house? When you said the house was too big for one person and we would have to sell it or move there ourselves? Cody looked down, realizing his wife was right. He had indeed said such things more than once, counting on the inheritance. But it was one thing to make plans for the future, and quite another to publicly humiliate his father in an attempt to speed up the process. "It was just a dream," he muttered. "I never tried to force Dad." "But I did," Stacy shouted. "I was the one trying to solve our problems while you sat there and said nothing. I wasted my energy trying to convince your father to do the right thing." Paige cried even harder. She sat on the sofa, hugging her new doll, and looked at the arguing adults with tear-filled eyes. On her birthday, the family celebration had turned into a scandal with shouting and accusations. "Mom, please don't yell," she sobbed. "I'm scared." But Stacy was too upset to pay attention to her daughter. "You know what, Lawrence? Get out of our house. And don't ever come back. If you don't consider us a family, then don't pretend to be a grandfather." "Stacy!" Cody exclaimed in horror. "What are you saying?" "I'm saying what I think," she replied. "Let him go to his precious Albert. We'll manage without him somehow." She grabbed the nursing home brochure from the table and threw it at me. The glossy pages scattered across the floor. "And take your gift with you. Maybe it will come in handy in Arizona." At that moment, the doorbell rang. Everyone froze, realizing that someone else might have heard the scandal. Cody hurried to open the door while Stacy tried to compose herself, realizing that she looked unpresentable. Mrs. Ryder was standing in the doorway with her daughter's forgotten purse in her hands. "Sorry to bother you," she said. "Melissa forgot her purse." The woman fell silent when she saw Paige in tears, Stacy disheveled, and the general atmosphere of conflict in the house. It was obvious that she had walked into the middle of a family scandal. "Thank you," Cody said quickly, taking the purse. "Tell Melissa that Paige says thank you for coming to the party." Mrs. Ryder nodded, but her gaze lingered on the scene in the living room. She had clearly heard the raised voices from the street and now saw the aftermath of the quarrel. This meant that tomorrow the whole street would know about Cody and Stacy's family scandal. When the door closed, Stacy realized she had gone too far. She had thrown a tantrum in front of her child and in front of a witness. Now the neighbors would gossip about how she had kicked her grandfather out of the house on his granddaughter's birthday. "Are you happy now?" Cody asked quietly as he returned to the living room. "Now the whole street will know about our problems." Stacy paled as she realized the magnitude of what had happened. Her reputation as a perfect wife and mother was in jeopardy. The neighbors, who had previously listened sympathetically to her stories about the difficulties of caring for her elderly father-in-law, now saw the true face of the caring daughter-in-law. "It's all his fault." She tried to blame me, but her voice no longer sounded so confident. "If he hadn't, if it weren't for that statement about moving, if you had behaved properly, nothing would have happened," Cody said sharply. "Dad has the right to live where he wants and spend his money how he wants. And you made a scene in front of your daughter and the neighbors." Stacy looked at the crying Paige and suddenly realized what she had done. In a fit of anger, she forgot everything. Her daughter's birthday, propriety, the consequences of her words. She revealed her true feelings about her husband's family, showing that all these years she had seen me only as a source of future inheritance. "Paige, sweetie," she tried to approach her daughter. "Mommy is a little upset, but everything is fine." "I don't want to," the girl shouted, turning away from her mother. "You were mean. You yelled at Grandpa." Stacy stopped dead in her tracks. Her own daughter was turning away from her on her birthday. The celebration had turned into a nightmare, and she was the only one to blame. I walked over to Paige and sat down next to her on the sofa. "Sweetheart, don't cry. Adults sometimes argue, but that doesn't mean we stop loving each other." "Grandpa, are you really leaving?" She sniffed. "Yes, granddaughter. But we'll see each other. And if you want, you can come visit me." "Will Mom come too?" I looked at Stacy, who was standing in the middle of the living room, realizing what she had done. Her face was pale, her eyes were red, and her hair was tousled. She looked like someone who had just realized the magnitude of her mistake. "That depends on your mother," I replied to Paige. Stacy stood in the middle of the living room, and I could see her realizing what had happened. Her carefully constructed facade of a respectable family woman had collapsed in a matter of minutes. The neighbors had heard her screams, her daughter had turned away from her husband had openly opposed her for the first time in a long time, and her potential inheritance had slipped through her fingers forever. I I didn't mean to, she muttered, looking at the crying Paige. It's not like that. I just... Her voice trembled, and I saw tears well up in her eyes. But these were not tears of remorse. Rather, tears of anger at herself for not being able to control herself and revealing her true motives. Stacy was not crying out of shame for her behavior, but out of frustration at her ruined plans. Stacy, Cody said wearily, maybe you should go upstairs and calm down. I'll stay with Paige and Dad. Calm down? She looked at him with a bitter laugh. How can I calm down when everything we've been counting on is falling apart? When your father is betraying the family? Dad isn't betraying anyone, Cody objected. He just wants to live his own life. His own life, Stacy wiped her tears with the back of her hand. Are we strangers? Isn't Paige his granddaughter? I understood that she was trying to manipulate the situation, to portray herself as the victim and me as a selfish old man abandoning his family. But after her candid admissions, this tactic no longer worked. Everyone present heard that it wasn't my relationship with Paige that bothered her, but the loss of control over the family property. Paige will always be my granddaughter, I said calmly, and if you stop making such scenes, we can maintain a relationship. If I stop, Stacy's voice rose again. Is it all my fault? Not you, who secretly planned to sell the house and run away, but me? Cody walked over to his wife and put his hand on her shoulder. Stacy, please. Paige is already scared. She jerked away from his touch. Don't touch me. You're a traitor too. You sat there silently the whole time, and now you're taking his side. I'm not taking anyone's side, Cody replied. I'm just trying to preserve what little dignity we have left on our daughter's birthday. At that moment, Stacy finally broke down. All the pent-up resentment, anger at her failed plans, and shame at her own behavior burst out in the form of sobs. She sank into a chair and covered her face with her hands, crying uncontrollably. You're all against me, she sobbed. I'm the only one thinking about the future of our family, and you don't understand me. I wanted what was best. Paige looked fearfully at her sobbing mother. The child did not understand the complexity of adult relationships, but she saw that on her birthday, for some reason, everyone was unhappy and angry with each other. She clung to my hand, seeking protection from this incomprehensible chaos. Mommy, don't cry, the girl said quietly. It's my birthday. But Stacy was too caught up in her own emotions to hear her daughter. She continued to cry, occasionally glancing at me with accusing eyes. 20 years, she said through her tears. 20 years I was a good daughter-in-law. I invited you to celebrations, bought you gifts, asked about your health, and now it turns out that it was all for nothing. Stacy, I said, sitting down on the sofa next to Paige, you're wrong. It wasn't 20 years. It was only the first few years that you were a good daughter-in-law. Then something changed. She looked up at me with reddened eyes. What changed? What did I do wrong? You started to see me not as a family member, but as a source of future benefits, I replied honestly. Every visit you made, every act of kindness you showed became an investment in your future inheritance. And today you openly admitted it. Stacy wanted to argue, but the words stuck in her throat. She knew I was right, but admitting it would mean agreeing that all her actions in recent years had been selfish. Meanwhile, Cody approached his daughter and sat down next to her. Paige, sweetheart, don't be upset. Grandpa's right. Adults sometimes argue, but that doesn't mean we stop loving each other. Daddy, why is Mommy crying? The girl asked. Cody looked at me in confusion. How could I explain to a 7-year-old that her mother was upset not because her grandfather was leaving, but because she was losing control of his property? Mommy is worried that Grandpa will be living far away, he said diplomatically. Can we go visit him? Paige asked. Of course we can, I replied for Cody. Arizona is very beautiful. There are mountains, desert, cacti. You'll love it. At these words, Stacy began to cry even harder. The prospect of expensive trips to another state only added to her grief over her lost inheritance. Is Uncle Albert nice? His granddaughter continued to ask. Very nice, I smiled. We've been friends since school. He's kind and cheerful. He has a dog named Buster. A dog, Paige exclaimed happily. Can I play with him? Of course you can. Cody listened to our conversation and seemed to begin to understand that his father's decision was indeed a well-considered one. I'm not just running away from family problems. I have specific plans, a place to live, and an old friend who is waiting for my arrival. Dad, does Albert know about your plans? He asked. Of course, we've been discussing this for several months. He was widowed 2 years ago and also lives alone in a big house. It will be easier for us together. Stacy looked up when she heard that the plans had been in the works for several months. Several months? So you were planning to abandon us even before tonight? I was planning to move, I corrected her. Whether or not to abandon the family was up to you. Me? She wiped away her tears. What do you mean? If you treated me like your husband's father, not like a source of inheritance, I would have considered moving closer to you. But after tonight, it became clear that it would be better for us to live far away from each other. Cody nodded thoughtfully. Dad, did you really think about moving in with us? I did. Albert suggested different options. Moving to Arizona with him or finding something closer to you. But tonight's gift showed that proximity would not be beneficial for us. Stacy sobbed again, realizing that her actions had finally pushed her father-in-law away. If she had shown genuine concern instead of selfish guardianship, perhaps things would have turned out differently. But now it was too late to change anything. I'm sorry, she whispered. I didn't mean to. I was really worried about you. Stacy, I said gently, if you were really worried about me, you wouldn't tell strangers made-up stories about my illnesses, and you wouldn't have handed out brochures for nursing homes at a children's party. She was silent, realizing she had no rebuttal. Her concern was too obvious and self-serving to seem sincere. At that moment, the doorbell rang again. Cody went to answer it, and we heard a familiar voice. Good evening. I'm Mrs. Jenkins from next door. Sorry to bother you, but we heard loud voices. Is everything okay? Cody hesitated, not knowing what to say. It was obvious that the neighbors had heard the argument and were now checking to see if they needed help. This meant that by morning, the whole street would know about Cody and Stacy's family problems. Everything's fine, thank you for your concern, he finally replied. We're just having a family discussion. I see, Mrs. Jenkins said in a tone that clearly showed she understood more than she was saying. Well, if you need anything, we're here. When the door closed, Stacy finally realized the magnitude of the disaster. Her reputation in the neighborhood was in jeopardy. Neighbors who had once seen her as the model wife and mother now knew that there were scandals in her home. My God, she whispered, what will they think of us now? They'll think the truth, Cody replied, that we're a normal family with normal problems. Stacy looked at the pages of the brochure scattered on the floor, at her tearful daughter, at her husband and father-in-law, who no longer considered her behavior acceptable. She realized that she couldn't change the situation, that too much had already been said. Without saying another word, she got up from her chair and headed for the stairs. Her steps were heavy and slow, like those of a person carrying the burden of awareness of their own mistakes. Mom, where are you going? Paige called out. Upstairs, Stacy replied hollowly, without turning around. I need to be alone. We heard her climb the stairs and the bedroom door slam. The living room fell silent, except for the ticking of the clock on the mantelpiece and the muffled sounds from the street. Dad, Cody said quietly, I'm really sorry about what happened. It's not your fault, son, I replied. Everyone is responsible for their own words and actions. Paige leaned wearily against my shoulder. It had been a long and difficult day for her, too much emotion for a 7-year-old. Grandpa, is my birthday ruined? She asked quietly. I hugged my granddaughter and kissed her on the top of her head. No, sweetheart. Your birthday was wonderful. You got presents, played with your friends, ate cake. Adult problems are a separate issue. Cody nodded in agreement. Dad's right, Paige. You had a wonderful birthday, and the doll Grandpa gave you is very pretty. The girl smiled and hugged her new toy tighter. Children recover from stress surprisingly quickly if adults make them feel safe. We sat there for another 20 minutes talking quietly about various little things. Cody picked up the scattered pages of the brochure, and I helped Paige gather her new toys. Gradually, the atmosphere in the house became calmer, although the tension had not completely disappeared. When Paige finally fell asleep on the sofa, covered with a blanket and hugging her new doll, Cody and I quietly moved to the kitchen. My son silently put the kettle on and took out 2 cups, clearly needing a break after a stressful evening. I sat down at the kitchen table. The same one where Janet and I used to drink tea with young Cody and Stacy during their first visits together. Dad, Cody finally broke the silence as he poured hot water into the cups. I need to tell you something. Stacy is right about one thing. We did discuss the house. Not that we made any specific plans, but, well, we talked about how sooner or later you might need help. I nodded as I accepted the cup of tea. I wasn't surprised by this admission. Every family discusses such issues when there are elderly relatives. The problem wasn't the conversations themselves, but how Stacy was trying to put those plans into action. That's normal, son, I said calmly. What's not normal is that your wife decided to speed up the process by portraying me as a helpless old man in front of strangers. Cody stared guiltily into his cup. I should have stopped her a long time ago. But you know, Dad, it's very difficult to argue with her at home. She knows how to turn any conversation around so that you start to doubt your own rightness. I understood my son. Stacy was indeed a master manipulator, able to present her selfish interests as concern for the family, and any objection as selfishness and heartlessness. Over the years of living together, she had learned to control Cody by exploiting his unwillingness to argue and his sense of responsibility for the family's well-being. What did your mother say about Stacy? Cody suddenly asked. The question caught me off guard. I took a sip of tea, gathering my thoughts. Janet. Yes, she talked about Stacy, especially in the last years before her illness, and she said things I didn't want to hear at the time. Mom saw right through Stacy, I admitted, especially in the last year of her life, when her illness made her more sensitive to the attitudes of those around her. Cody looked up, waiting for me to continue. Do you remember when Stacy came to visit us in the hospital? I asked. She always said the right things, brought flowers, asked about Mom's health, but Janet sensed something was wrong. I got up and walked to the window, looking out at the dark street. Memories of the last months of my wife's life were always difficult for me, but now it was important to share them with my son. Once when Stacy left, my mother said to me, Lawrence, that woman is studying me like an exhibit in a museum. She's not worried about my health. She's calculating how long I have left. I was indignant then and said she was being unfair to my sister-in-law. Cody grimaced painfully, as if those words had hit a sore spot. Mom continued to observe, I continued. She said that Stacy behaves differently when she thinks no one is watching her, that there is a kind of evaluative expression in her eyes when she looks around our house. Dad, why didn't you tell me this before? Cody asked quietly. I turned to him. Because she was your wife, the mother of your child. What right did I have to interfere in your relationship? Besides, I hope Mom was wrong, that Stacy just didn't know how to express her feelings. But even after Janet's death, I couldn't forget her last words about her daughter-in-law. When my wife was lying at home in our bedroom during the last days of her life, she called me and took my hand. Lawrence, she said in a weak voice, when I'm gone, be careful with Stacy. She'll try to control your life. Don't let her. At the time, I thought it was the illness talking, that the medication was affecting her perception of reality. But now I realize that Janet was right about everything. Stacy really did start her campaign almost immediately after the funeral. At first cautiously, with feigned concern, and then more and more insistently. Mom saw what I didn't want to see, I continued, returning to the table. And today, Stacy herself confirmed all her fears. Cody was silent, digesting what he had heard. It must have been hard for him to realize that his wife had made such an impression on my dying wife that she felt the need to warn me. Dad, he finally said, when did you decide to move to Albert? Finally, tonight, I replied honestly, but I started thinking about it back in the winter, when Stacy became particularly insistent in offering me help. I took my phone out of my pocket and looked at the time. It was 10:30 in the evening. It was 2 hours earlier in Arizona, so 8:30 was a good time to call. Cody, I'm going to call Albert and tell him that the decision is final, I said. My son nodded. Sure, Dad. I dialed the familiar number and waited for an answer. My old friend's voice sounded cheerful and happy. Lawrence, how are you, buddy? How was your granddaughter's birthday? Hi, Albert. The birthday went. Well, I replied, I'm ready to move. When can I come? Really? There was genuine excitement in my friend's voice. Lawrence, that's wonderful. Come tomorrow if you want. The house is ready. Your room is furnished, and Buster is already missing his new friend. I couldn't help but smile as I listened to Albert's enthusiasm. My old school friend had always been an optimist, able to find the bright side in any situation. After the death of his wife, Ruth, he didn't give up, but on the contrary began to live more actively, traveling, pursuing hobbies, socializing with people. Tomorrow is too soon, of course, I laughed, but definitely in the next few weeks. I need to finalize the sale of the house and pack my things. Oh, I can help you with selling the house, Albert offered. I have a real estate agent I know, a very smart guy. If you want, I'll give him your number. That would be great. What happened? My friend asked in a more serious tone. Last time you said you were still thinking about it. I looked at Cody, who was listening intently to my part of the conversation. My sister-in-law gave me a brochure for a nursing home today, at a family celebration in front of guests. Wow, Albert whistled. How rude. And what did you do? I announced my plans to move in with you and sell the house. And how did she react? She threw a tantrum, kicked me out of the house, and cried in front of the child. The neighbors heard the scandal. Albert paused for a few seconds, then said, Lawrence, you made the right decision. You know what I like about our age? We can finally live for ourselves without having to justify ourselves to anyone. Those words sounded like liberation. Indeed, at 73, I had the right to live my life as I saw fit. I raised a son, worked for 45 years, buried my wife, and endured grief and loneliness. And now I deserved the right to a peaceful old age surrounded by people who valued me as a person, not as a source of inheritance. You know, Albert, I feel such a relief, I confessed. It's as if a weight has been lifted from my shoulders. Of course. How long can you put up with rudeness disguised as concern? Come quickly. There's sunshine, mountains, clean air, and no one will try to sell you brochures for nursing homes. We talked for another 15 minutes, discussing the practical details of the move. Albert told me about his plans for the coming months. He wanted to buy a small fishing boat, sign up for Spanish lessons, and visit the Grand Canyon National Park. His life was full and active, despite his 74 years. Lawrence, how did your granddaughter react to the news? He asked at the end of the conversation. Fine. She was happy that I would have a dog. She wants to come visit. Great. Children love Buster. And Ruth always said that a house without children's laughter is not a home. After talking to my friend, I felt a surge of energy. The plan to move was no longer an abstract idea. It was taking shape. I had a place to go, a person waiting for me, and specific steps to take. Cody looked at me with a new expression. It seemed that for the first time in a long time, he saw me not as an aging father who needed care, but as an independent person capable of making decisions and building plans. Dad, do you really want to go fishing? He asked with a slight smile. Why not? I replied. When I was young, your mother and I often went to the lake. I remember how you asked to come with us when you were a child. I remember, Cody nodded. You taught me how to cast a line. Then you can teach Paige when you come to visit, I said. My son thought for a moment. Dad, do you think we'll be able to come? Stacy is unlikely to. Stacy is your problem, Cody, I said gently but firmly. I'm not going to accommodate her moods and plans anymore. If you want to maintain a relationship with your father, you're welcome to do so. If not, that's your choice too. He nodded slowly, realizing that the days when everything revolved around Stacy's desires were over. Now it was up to each of them to decide what was more important to them, family ties or financial considerations. We finished our tea in quiet silence. There were no sounds coming from upstairs. Stacy was probably still recovering from today's scandal, and in the living room, Paige was sleeping peacefully, hugging her new doll. For her, this day remained a birthday with presents and cake, and adult problems seemed distant and not very understandable. I looked at my watch. It was time to go home. Tomorrow I had phone calls to real estate agents, planning the move, and the beginning of a new chapter in my life. And for the first time in a long time, I thought about it not with anxiety, but with anticipation. I put the empty cup in the sink and looked at Cody. My son was sitting at the table, thoughtfully twirling a teaspoon in his hands, clearly reflecting on everything he had heard today. In his eyes, I saw a mixture of shame, confusion, and some new understanding of the situation. Perhaps for the first time in many years, He saw what was happening in the family not through the eyes of Stacy's husband, but through the eyes of his father's son. "Dad," he said quietly without looking up, "I'm really ashamed of tonight. For Stacy, for not intervening sooner, for everything." "Cody," I replied, sitting back down, "don't blame yourself for everything. Family life is complicated, and it's not always easy to stand up to someone close to you, even when you know they're wrong." My son looked up at me, and I saw in his eyes the same helplessness I remember from his childhood when he didn't know how to handle a difficult situation. Back then, I could always help him with advice or just a hug, but now his problems were adult ones, and he had to solve them himself. "What should I do about Stacy?" he asked. "How can I explain to her that she was wrong? She sincerely believes that she was looking out for you." I sighed, realizing that my son was in for a rough time. Stacy wasn't the kind of person who easily admitted her mistakes. Most likely she would try to shift the blame onto me, portraying herself as the victim of a selfish father-in-law who abandoned his family for his own whims. "Cody, your wife didn't care about me," I said bluntly. "She cared about her own future well-being, and today she admitted it herself. Whether you can live with that is up to you." Paige stirred in the living room. She woke up from our hushed voices and rubbed her eyes sleepily. Seeing us in the kitchen, she got up from the sofa and, still holding her doll, walked toward us. "Grandpa, aren't you leaving yet?" she asked, yawning. "Not yet, sweetheart," I smiled. "But now it's time to go home. It's late." "When are you going to Arizona?" Paige asked, climbing onto my lap. "In a few weeks. I need time to get everything ready. Will you miss us?" That simple childish question touched me more than all of today's dramatic events. Of course, I would miss my granddaughter. She was the only person in this house who loved me sincerely, without any calculations or conditions. "Of course I'll miss you," I replied, hugging her. "Especially you. But we'll talk on the phone and see each other on video calls, and you'll come visit me in the summer." "What if Mom won't let me?" Paige suddenly asked. Her question caught me off guard. Did a 7-year-old girl already understand that her mother could use her as a tool to pressure her grandfather? Or did she just intuitively sense the tension in the family? "Mom will let you," Cody interjected, though his voice wasn't entirely confident. "Grandpa's your family, and you have a right to see him." I was grateful to my son for those words. Whatever his relationship with Stacy might be in the future, he wouldn't let her sever the bond between me and my granddaughter. At least, I hope so. "Paige, sweetheart, you have to sleep in your own bed tonight," I said. "You have school tomorrow. You need to get some sleep." "Okay," she agreed and hugged me tightly. "I love you, Grandpa." "I love you too, sweetheart." Cody picked up his daughter. "Come on, sweetie, I'll put you to bed." They headed upstairs and I stayed in the kitchen, gathering my thoughts. There was still no sound coming from the bedroom. Stacy was either asleep or still reeling from the failure of her plans today. In any case, I was glad I wouldn't have to talk to her anymore. A few minutes later, Cody returned and quietly closed the door to the nursery behind him. "She fell asleep quickly," he said. "It was a tough day." "For all of us," I agreed. We walked silently into the hallway. I put on my jacket and shoes and checked my pockets. Cody stood nearby, clearly wanting to say something, but unable to find the words. "Dad," he finally managed, "I want you to know that you'll always be welcome in this house, no matter what Stacy thinks." "Thank you, son. That means a lot to me. And about the trips to Arizona, I'll definitely bring Paige. Maybe not right away. I'll have to settle things here first, but I'll definitely bring her." I nodded, realizing that Cody was being sincere, even though life might throw a wrench in those plans. Stacy wouldn't forgive him for today's betrayal, and I wouldn't be surprised if she tried to use every means possible to punish both me and her husband. "Cody, whatever your relationship with Stacy may be in the future, remember one thing," I said, putting my hand on his shoulder. "You're a good man and a good father. Don't let anyone convince you otherwise." My son nodded, and I saw tears well up in his eyes. He understood that something had changed irrevocably in our family today, that the old relationship could never be restored. "Dad, are you sure you don't want to stay here tonight?" he suggested. "Tomorrow everything may look different." "No, Cody. Nothing will change tomorrow. Stacy won't become a different person overnight, and I won't forget what I heard today." I opened the door and stepped out onto the porch. The night air was fresh and cool, smelling of autumn leaves and rain. The street was quiet, with only the occasional car passing by, its headlights illuminating the wet asphalt. "Dad, how are you going to get home?" Cody asked. "I'll call a taxi," I replied, taking out my phone. "Maybe I can give you a ride. The car's in the garage." "No need, son. Stacy might wake up and start another fight because you're helping me. Better not to provoke her." Cody nodded understandingly. He was beginning to realize what a difficult position he was in, choosing between his wife and his father. And although today he took my side, tomorrow he would have to live with the consequences of that choice. I dialed the taxi service and ordered a car. The dispatcher said the driver would be there in 10 minutes. Cody and I stood on the porch waiting for her to arrive, talking about trivial things, the weather, work, plans for the weekend. We both knew that this might be our last normal conversation for a long time. "You know, Dad," Cody said, "Mom really did warn you." I remember her saying something about Stacy, but at the time I thought it was just my mother-in-law being jealous of her daughter-in-law. "Janet was a wise woman," I replied. "She was good at reading people. It's a shame I didn't listen to her sooner." "Don't blame yourself, Cody. People in love rarely listen to warnings. And it wasn't your mistake, it was mine. I should have put Stacy in her place much earlier, not allowed her antics." The headlights of an approaching car appeared on the street. The taxi stopped in front of the house, and the driver waved cheerfully. I turned to my son and hugged him. "Take care of yourself and Paige," I said. "And remember, you can always come to me if you need help." "Thanks, Dad. You take care too. Call me when you get home." I walked to the car, feeling a strange lightness in my chest. Some burden I had been carrying for the past few years had suddenly disappeared. I no longer had to pretend I didn't notice Stacy's disrespect. I no longer had to put up with her barbs and insinuations. I no longer had to feel like a stranger in my own son's house. "Good evening," greeted the driver, a middle-aged man with a kind face. "Where to?" I gave him my address and settled into the back seat. The car pulled away, and I looked out the window at Cody's house. A light was on in one of the second-floor windows. Stacy probably hadn't fallen asleep. I wonder what she's thinking about right now. Does she regret not holding back? Or is she making new plans for revenge? "Family matters?" the driver asked sympathetically, glancing at me in the rearview mirror. "You could say that," I smiled. "But good family matters." "I see," he nodded. "You have a kind of liberated look on your face, like someone who has finally solved an important problem." An accurate observation. I really did feel liberated. Years of towing the line, trying to please an impossible sister-in-law, putting up with her insults disguised as concern, all that was in the past now. Now I could live the way I wanted and hang out with people who appreciated me for who I was. "How far are you going to move?" the driver continued to ask curiously. "To Arizona," I replied. "To an old friend." "It's good there," he nodded approvingly. "Warm, sunny, just right for older people. My father-in-law moved there 5 years ago and is very happy. He says his only regret is that he didn't do it sooner." We drove through sleepy Sheridan, past familiar streets and houses. Every turn reminded me of some stage of my life here. Here was the store where Janet and I used to buy groceries in the early years of our marriage. Here was the cafe where she liked to drink coffee with her friends. Here was the school where Cody went. Here was the library where I spent my Saturday mornings after retiring. Soon all this would be in the past. But for some reason, I wasn't sad. On the contrary, I felt excited about a new life, new experiences, new opportunities. At 73, I could still have 10, 15, or even 20 years of active life ahead of me. And I intended to live them the way I wanted, not the way someone else found convenient. "Aren't you sorry to leave your grandchildren behind?" asked the driver. "Granddaughter," I corrected him. "One, and I'm not leaving her. I'll just see her differently. The quality of communication is more important than the quantity." "That's true," he agreed. "Better to have rare but good meetings than constant but forced ones." We pulled up to my house. It stood in the shade of old trees, dark and silent, but not sad, just waiting. Tomorrow I will start preparing for the move, sorting through my things, deciding what to take with me and what to leave behind. The house will find new owners who will fill it with their lives, their voices, their laughter. "How much do I owe you?" I asked, taking out my wallet. $12, replied the driver. I gave him 15 and said, Thank you for the pleasant conversation. Good luck in your new life, he said goodbye. And you're right not to cling to the past. The car drove away and I was left alone in front of my house. I climbed the familiar steps of the porch, unlocked the door, and entered the hallway. The house greeted me with silence and peace. No one here would criticize my choice, discuss my supposed forgetfulness, or offer me brochures for nursing homes. I walked into the living room and turned on the floor lamp. The room was illuminated with soft light, and I saw all the familiar objects. The armchair I loved to sit in the evenings, the bookshelves, the photographs on the walls. Soon all of this would have to be packed up or sold. But right now I just wanted to sit in silence and enjoy my decision. I settled into my favorite chair and closed my eyes. For the first time in a long time, the future seemed to me not a source of anxiety, but a source of opportunity. Arizona, the sun, the mountains, fishing with Albert, new acquaintances, travel, all of this lay ahead. And behind me were years of humiliation, pretense, and towing the line. My phone vibrated in my pocket. Message from Cody. Dad, are you home? Is everything okay? I typed a reply. Home, everything's fine. Good night. A minute later, the reply came. Good night, I love you. I smiled as I read those words. Whatever happened between me and Stacy, my connection with my son remained intact. And that meant my connection with my granddaughter, too. The rest didn't matter. I went upstairs, changed into my pajamas, and got into bed. The bedroom was quiet and peaceful. There was a photo of Janet on the nightstand, and I thought she was smiling approvingly. Well, dear, I whispered, looking at the picture, it seems I've finally taken your advice. No one will control me anymore. Outside the window, the maple leaves rustled, the very ones she and I had planted many years ago. Tomorrow, a new life full of changes and opportunities would begin. And today was the last day I let anyone humiliate me under the guise of caring. I closed my eyes and fell fast asleep, for the first time in a long time, not worrying about what Stacy would say, what others would think, or whether I was doing the right thing. Right. Period.